Chapter 13, page 83. The regatta did not end as well as it started for Washington. After the freshmen's crew's stunning victory, College Albrechtsen varsities lost to California. The Olympic Games were still 2 years away, but Albrechtsen was left staring at a cold hard fact. His rival at Cal, Kai Ebereit, just seemed to have an uncanny knack for winning those ones that mattered most. That very evening, the national newspapers began to carry stories saying that certainly the boys from Cal would be going to the Olympics in 1936. Joe took a roundabout journey home from Poughkeepsie. He visited his aunt and his uncle in Pennsylvania and then traveled down to New Orleans. Marveling at the sight of the huge ships making their way up to the Mississippi, eating huge platters full of cheap shrimp and crab, digging into steamy bowls of gumbo and jambalaya, sucking up the jazz and the blues on his way home, he traveled across America that had begun to dry up and blow away. It was the beginning of what would be called the Dust Bowl. Intense heat was scorching crops across the country. The colossal dust storm had swung out in the eastern Montana, rolled east, dumped 12 million tons of dirt on Chicago, then moved on to tower over Boston and New York. People in New York's Central Park stood and looked up in astonishment at the blackened sky. Somewhat in the neighborhood of 350 million tons of American topsoil had become airborne in a single storm. As Joe traveled north and west, staring out train windows, it seemed as if the whole country had withered and browned under the searing sun. Deep piles of powdery dust lay among the fence lines. Windmills stood motionless, gaunt cattle, and the ribs protruding and their heads hanging low, stood listless at the bottoms of dried-up ponds. Under the fierce sun, people raised their hands to their brows and stared at Joe's train as it passed by, giving it a cold, hard look, wishing they could be aboard and go somewhere else, anywhere else. That summer, Joe moved back to the half-finished house in Sequim, desperate to conjure up enough money to get through another school year. He cut more hay, dug more ditches, and spread more hot black asphalt on the highway. He tried snagging salmon again soon, too, but the game warden sneaked up on him from behind one day, slamming a piece of driftwood against the back of Joe's head and knocking him cold. He came to a few moments later, just in time for his friend Harry Secker chasing the warden down the river with a pole. The boys got away, but they knew the warden would be back, so they never snagged a salmon again. Mostly Joe worked in the woods with Clary McDonald. One afternoon, Charlie took Joe upriver hunting for cedar for new roof on his farmhouse. The upper reaches of his property had logged for the first time in just a dozen years before. The loggers had taken the prime middle section of each tree, leaving long sections from the tops where the branches were, and where the bottoms were, the trunks began to flare out, and the grain of wood no longer ran perfectly straight and true. Some of the cedars had been more than 2,000 years old, and the stumps that remained were 7 or 8 feet in diameter, just as tall. They rose in the ground like ancient monuments. Charlie led Joe among the stumps and down trees, teaching him how to understand what lay beneath the bark of the fallen logs. Most of the wood cut could still be used, but only if one knew how to read the wood, to decipher its inner structure. Charlie rolled them over, felt for hidden knots and irregularities. He crouched down to the cut ends and peered at the annual growth rings. Joe was fascinated, intrigued by the idea that he could learn to see what others could not see in the wood. He was thrilled at the notion that something valuable could be found in what others had passed over and left behind. Within a few days, Joe had mastered the tools used to cut and split the massive logs. A year of rowing had made his arms and shoulders strong, and he worked his way through the cedar like a machine. Proud of his new skill, he found that shaping cedar satisfied him down to his core and gave him peace. He liked the way that the splitting wood murmured to him before it parted, almost as if it was alive. As the wood opened up, it always perfumed the air, and the spicy sweet aroma that rose from freshly split cedar was familiar one from the shell house in Seattle. After a few years earlier, Pocock had made the revolutionary decision to begin crafting the skins of his rowing shells out of native Washington cedar. Pocock found the wood to be light, springy, and strong. He believed that cedar shells had a kind of liveliness, a tendency to spring forward with each stroke in a way that no other design or material could duplicate. To Pocock, there was a magic in the cedar, an unseen force that imparted life to the shells he built. Now, out in the woods, the scent of the freshly split logs brought Pocock to Joe's mind. Joe had been thinking a lot about Pocock lately. The man was mysterious, but seemed to Joe that there was a connection between the boat builder in his shop and what he was trying to do himself. There was among a pile of freshly split cedar, striving to master his skills, striving to become truly excellent at something difficult. When Joe arrived back at the shell house on October 5th, 1934, it was another radiant afternoon, much like the day that he had first shown up as a freshman. But there was a different attitude among the bunch of boys Joe had rowed with last year. As they moved in and out of the shell house in shorts and jerseys, helping Coach Boyles register the new freshmen, there was an unmistakable hint of swagger in their step. After all, they were the national freshman champions. Now as sophomores, it was their turn to grin at the nervous freshmen climbing awkwardly aboard Old Nero. There were other reasons to be confident. Over the summer, there had been suggestions that Ulberkenson should elevate them to varsity status immediately, even though the juniors and seniors usually made up that first crew. It seemed profoundly unlikely, but the idea was out there in public, and the sophomore boys had already begun to talk quietly about it among themselves. Ulberkson had been thinking about it as well, but the last thing he needed was a bunch of upstart sophomores to start thinking that they were God's gift to rowing. They were good, but they were still green, not yet great. A great oarsman needed to be a rare balance of ego and humility. For now what he saw was strutting around the shell house and lounging in the doorway was plenty of ego, but not much humility. Coach Boyles had told Ulberkson to look particularly hard at the couple of boys. One was the baby of the boat, a 17-year-old boy in the number 2 seat, 6'3" George Shorty Hunt. He was an ox for work and absolutely indispensable, but he was high-strung, nervous, someone you often had to treat with kid gloves to settle down like a racehorse. The other was a blond kid with the crew cut in the number 3 seat, Joe Rance. Ulberkson remembered him as the boy he had spotted in gym at Roosevelt High 2 years before. He was as poor as a church mouse. Anybody could tell that just by looking at him. When he wanted to, though, Boyles had reported Joe Rance would row longer and harder than any man in the boat. The problem was that he didn't always seem to want to. All last spring he had been on one day off the next. He had learned to square up, but he marched to his own drummer. Though other boys had taken to calling him Mr. Individuality, he was physically tough, independent, confident, friendly, and yet at the same time strangely sensitive. He seemed to have tender spots that you had to watch out for if you wanted him to come through for you. Though nobody, not even the other sophomores, could figure out quite what they were. But Al Ulberkson wasn't one to waste a lot of time trying to figure out a touchy kid's tender spots. He picked up the megaphone and barked at the sophomores to assemble down on the ramp. The boys shuffled toward the water. Ulrichsen stood higher on the raft so he could be looking down at even the tallest boys. He gazed out at the moment, saying nothing, and then he began to tell them how it was going to be. "You will eat no fried meats," he began abruptly. "You will eat no pastries, but you will eat plenty of vegetables. You will eat good, substantial, wholesome food, the kind of food your mother makes. You will go to bed at 10 o'clock and arise punctually at 7 o'clock. You will not smoke or drink. You will follow this regime all year round. For as long as you row for me, you will not use profane language in the shell house, nor anywhere within my hearing. You will keep at your studies and retain a high grade point average. You will not disappoint your parents nor your crewmates. Now let's row." 2 weeks later, Ulrichsen listed the 5 tentative boatings, or crew rosters, for the new year. There were 5 potential varsity boats in all. Most were made up of a mix of sophomores, juniors, and seniors. Only one boat from the previous season remained intact, Joe's boat, with Shorty Hunt at the 2 seat and Roger Morris at the 7, but least anyone, particularly the sophomores themselves, read too much into it. Ulrichsen put the boat far down in the list. The sophomore boys were not in the first boat or the second. Ulrichsen placed them 5th. As fall training season got underway, the boys' swagger promptly disappeared from their steps. Ulrichsen was a harder man than Bowles, and this season would clearly be harder than the last. Joe in particular struggled to keep up his spirits. It wasn't the status of the boat that worried him. It wasn't the brutality of how long workouts of the days of rowing in the rain and the bitter cold. Despite the long summers of work, Joe found himself even poorer than he had been the previous year. He could hardly afford to take Joyce out on dates of any kind now. There were family matters eating at Joe as well. He had found that Harry and Thala and his half-siblings were living in Seattle. They had been there all along, in fact, since the night of 1929, when they had driven away and left Joe behind in Squirm. Over the years, they had moved from home to home. First, they lived in a dilapidated shed in the waterfront with rats scurrying around the 2 rooms. Harry could not find work, and when they moved into a different house, it was hardly an improvement. They could not even afford firewood to fuel the one stove that had heated the house. Thala had frequent local soup kitchens looking for free food. Most meals she managed to put before her children consisted of thin stews made of parsnips, rutabagas, potatoes, and chipped beef. When Harry finally landed a decent job as a mechanic, he moved the family to a small but respectable house, not far from where Joe rode nearly every afternoon. That's where Joe found them in the fall of 1934. His brother Fred had given him the address, and Joe and Joyce drove over one afternoon. They parked, took deep breaths, and climbed a flight of concrete steps to the front porch, holding hands. They could hear someone playing violin inside. Joe knocked on a yellow Dutch door, and the violin fell silent. A shadow moved behind the lace curtains on the upper half of the door. There was a moment of hesitation, then Thala opened the door halfway. She did not seem particularly surprised to see them. Joe had the sense that she'd been expecting this for a long time. She glanced at Joyce and nodded at her pleasantly enough, but she made no move to invite them. There was a long moment of silence. Joe thought Thala looked careworn and exhausted, much older than her 36 years. Her face was pale and drawn. Her eyes was a bit sunken. Joe focused for a moment on her fingers and saw they were red and chafed. Finally, Joe broke the silence. "Hello, Thala. We just came by to see how you are doing." Dolly peered at them silently for a moment, her expression veiled, and dropped her eyes as she began to speak. "We're fine, Joe. We're doing fine now. How's school going?" Joe said it was going well, but he was on the crew now. Dolly responded that she had heard that, and that her family and that his father was proud of him. She asked Joyce how her parents were doing and expressed her regret when Joyce replied that her father was quite ill. Dolly continued to hold the door just half open, her body blocking the entrance. Even as she addressed him, Joe noticed she continued to look down at the porch, as if studying something at her feet, trying to find an answer to something there. Finally, Joe asked if they could come in and say hello to his father and kids. Dolly said that Harry was at work and the kids were visiting friends. Joe asked if he and Joyce could come back and visit them another time. Dolly seemed suddenly to find what she had been looking for. She raised her eyes abruptly and leveled at Joe. "No," she said, her voice colder now. "Make your own life, Joe. Stay out of ours." And with that, she closed the door gently and slid the deadbolt into a position with a soft metallic click. As they drove away, Joyce fumed. Over the years, she had been slowly learning about Joe's life and what had happened at the Golden Ruby mine in Sequim. She could now understand how Dolly had been so cold, how his father had been so weak, and why Joe himself seemed to show little anger all about it. Finally, as Joe pulled over to the curb to drop her off at the judge's home, Joyce erupted. Why did he go on pretending that he had not done any harm? What kind of a woman would leave a boy alone in this world? What kind of a father would let her do that? She was nearly sobbing by the time she finished. She glanced across the seat at Joe and saw at once, through a blur of tears, that his eyes were full of hurt too. But his jaw was set, and he stared ahead over the steering wheel rather than turning to look at her. "You don't understand," he murmured. "They don't have any choice. There were just too many mouths to feed." Joyce thought about that for a moment, and then said, "I don't understand why you don't get angry." Joe continued to stare ahead through the windshield. "It takes energy to get angry. It eats you up inside. I can't waste my energy like that and expect to get ahead. When they left, it took everything, and I had it in me to survive. Now I have to stay focused. I gotta stay and take care of things myself."